Okay, there we go.
Okay, so to remind you, the most fundamental basis for the League of Women Voters is that we are nonpartisan. That means that we do not stand for or promote any political party or candidate for office. However, that does not mean that we are not political. When we engage, we advocate and educate around positions that have been developed by League members nationally over the past over 100 years. The categories we work on are governmental policies, social policies, and natural resources policies. Our motto is making democracy work. I want to thank Kathy Meyer for putting this particular discussion together. Kathy, you may know, is the vice president of the Larimer League. And even more important, those of you who attended the nationwide rally, Hands Off Our Democracy, we try. Kathy was the speaker on how our voting rights, how our ability and right to vote is being impacted. And that was a pretty powerful and necessary presentation. We will take your questions both in the chat and by raising your hand. Kathy and I will both do that most likely at the end of the talk, but occasionally we might interrupt if the question is related to exactly what our speaker is talking about. Kathy, you can go ahead and introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you all for coming. This is the South Larimer Discussion Group from the League of Women Voters of Larimer County. Tonight we have with us Jeff Stahla from Northern Water. And he's going to be talking to us about the Chimney Hollow Reservoir project. So Jeff is the Public Information Officer for Northern Water, which provides water to Fort Collins, Greeley, Loveland, Longmont, Boulder, Louisville, Lafayette, Broomfield, a lot of other smaller communities, rural and domestic water districts, and local industries. Before joining Northern Water, he had been a journalist in the region for more than 20 years, most recently serving as the editor of the Loveland Reporter-Herald. He's a native of Greeley and a graduate of Colorado State University, and he lives in Loveland with his wife, Susan. So some of us might know Jeff. He's been around a while, lives in our neighborhood. I know Jeff from serving on the Larimer County Parks Board, where he's usually present in giving us updates on what the situation with the reservoirs is and this Chimney Hollow project. He's always a wealth of information and very interesting to listen to. So I'm sure all of you, we're all looking forward to his presentation. So take her away, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Kathy. Thank you for the
wait a second.
Excellent introduction. Oh, yes.
Kathy, would you mute everyone? Because sometimes, you know, the dog comes in the room and so forth.
Okie doke.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you. And while I very much appreciate the compliment that Kathy gave that I'm an engaging speaker, I'm actually going to not have the camera on me the entire time. I have a small little group of slides that I think will help explain some of the topics that I'm going to go into. And I'm really going to focus this, yes, on the construction update for Chimney Hollow Reservoir. I mean, that's certainly top of mind for everyone. But I wanted to give a little bit of background, just a little bit of why do we need it? Where's the water going to come from? And put that into context, because certainly those are questions that we get all the time about just what we do at Northern Water and how it works into the bigger framework of water resources in the American West. So if you'll indulge me for just a second, I will share my screen, and I think we're off and running. So this is, out of my 78 slides, this is the easiest one. No, and I don't have 78. So so let's start at, well, not the beginning, but kind of the beginning of European settlement in this area. And where I like to start is with Stephen Long. He was an explorer and was in the U.S. Army and was given the task of really discovering and cataloging what the United States had purchased in the Louisiana Purchase between where Lewis and Clark had gone to the north and where Zebulon Pike had gone on the south. So he and his crew marched up the South Platte River, and They got a late start. They started in Omaha in late May, and it wasn't until July 4th that they got to about where Platteville is today, so just east of us here in southern Larimer County. And he got there, and it was a hot, dusty day. And by then, the runoff from the South Platte had dried up, and the plants had kind of gone into dormancy and had started to turn brown. And so he called this the Great Desert. And there were very few trees, and certainly there were prickly pear cactuses. And he and his team just said, this is not going to be fit for agriculture. Now, what's interesting is the other scientists who were with him, the botanists, the biologists, the ethnographers, they looked around and saw something a little bit different. The biologists wrote in their journals while they were in Colorado that they could see horizon to horizon of bison and elk and deer and even prairie dogs. They described those. And certainly those were not the animals that you would associate with a desert. And by the same token, the ethnographers looked around and saw plenty of signs of human life. That they saw that the Pawnee and the Arapaho and Cheyenne had built, if not permanent structures, certainly things like hunting lodges and improvements on the land that were easily detectable as human improvements. And so those were noted by this expedition. And that comes back to guide us a little bit because, again, in Colorado, it is certainly, it's got the building blocks for being able to create settlements and cities, but there's some important things that you need to do to improve things. And where that is in water. And so I guess I'm going to start actually on the water side with how we really started to look at the land and what it was capable of as the next wave and next generation of settlers came to northern Colorado. And so really the first big group to settle and have grand visions for agriculture were the folks who founded Union Colony, and that later became Greeley. And so in the 1870s, they go to Greeley and they start digging ditches. And what the Greeley folks did that was really kind of the unique and noteworthy task was to build ditches far upstream on the Poudre and Big Thompson rivers and divert that water along um, the bluffs to get it up onto the tabletop land. And so this isn't the river valleys, the floodplains, but actually getting it to places like where Greeley is and where Eaton and Alt and Windsor are to be able to get that water onto that very, very fertile soil. And what they discovered is that if you put water on that soil, coupled with the sunshine and the climate around here, you can grow just about anything. And so by 1873, they're building and growing enough to feed themselves and sell some additional surplus to the markets in Denver and Cheyenne and beyond. And so that gave people the idea that this really was fertile agricultural land if you could get water to it, that it wasn't just a barren desert. And so in 1874, the folks in Greeley are doing that same work of bringing water to their fields when they wake up on one July day and they see that their ditches have gone empty. And same thing with the Poudre River, that it's no longer flowing downstream. And so they knew that it had been flowing the day before, and so it was really unusual. So they did what normal folks would do, and that would be march upstream to see what the problem was. And it turned out that there was a real estate developer who had incorporated a little community upstream and had used some of the same expertise to build their own ditches to be able to water the tabletop lands around their community. And that community was Fort Collins. And so when the Greeley people talked to the Fort Collins folks, they said, "Why are you doing this? We were here first." And the Fort Collins folks replied that under Eastern United States water law, they had all the rights to be able to use that water. They were upstream and they were next to the riverbank. And so Greeley could go pound sand. Well, Greeley responded by saying, water out here is so precious, it almost should be treated like a precious mineral, that you file a mineral right on it. And so if you were here first, you had that first claim. And so that tension between traditional riparian, or basically river rules from back east, versus a new regimen out here, really got those two communities in conflict. The good news is that in 1874, the year that river dried up, we had a really strong monsoon. And so the river filled back up, crops got out of the ground, and we were able to move forward for both communities. But it got them thinking about what was the future going to be like in northern Colorado. And so 2 years later, in 1876, when the Colorado Constitution is written, it states, okay, Colorado is a public resource, or not Colorado, water is a public resource owned by all of us. And for water, they had to decide which way we were going to go. And as the two sides were presenting their arguments, there was a group from southern Colorado, the folks who had the Spanish land grants in the San Luis Valley, who said, we were here before all of you, and I think that we would prefer that first in time, first in right to protect our interests. And so with the compromise brokered, the Colorado Constitution puts into writing that we are a prior appropriation state, that water is a natural resource, and that if you were here first, then you have first access to it. But they build a couple of other provisions in. So second of all, they put in that, yes, water is owned by all of us. So no one actually owns water. You only own the right to use it. And so if you're going to make one of those claims to use water, then you have to show that you are using it for a beneficial purpose. And what that meant at the time was, are you using it for municipal use, for drinking water, for growing plants in your garden? Are you using it for agricultural use or industrial use? Now, over the years, we've added some additional categories for that beneficial use, like environmental use, in-stream flows, recreation flows. But at the end, it's a matter of, if you are going to take water out of a river, you have to demonstrate, first of all, when are you doing so? So where do you fall on the list of priorities? And what are you going to use it for? It has to be a beneficial use. And how much are you going to use? That you can only take out of the river only the amount that you're going to use. That any more than that would be speculation. Because what they didn't want, the original founders and the writers of the Colorado Constitution, they didn't want people to build big reservoirs that had no use and then wait till everyone else got thirsty and then sell it at a higher inflated price. And so in Colorado, you have to use water for a beneficial purpose, or you lose the right to use that water. So moving forward, and then this slide that we have in front of us here is that by the end of the 1800s, by the end of the 19th century, we figured out how to access most of the available water rights on the Front Range. So the Poudre River, the Big Thompson, the Little Thompson, and the St. Vrain, up and down the Front Range, people had made claims on most of that water. Not all of it, and we'll talk about that later, but most of the natural average flows were being taken out of the river. And so folks on the Front Range said, well, we have some more additional land that we would like to bring into production, that this soil is so good and the climate is so good. If we can find out additional sources, then we would like to bring those to the Front Range. And so with that, you have schemes to bring over water from the other side of the Continental Divide. And what this picture here shows is the Grand River Ditch that is actually on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park, on the west side of the Colorado River, that catches water that would be intended for the Colorado River and sends it north through a pass to the Poudre River instead of the Colorado River sending it south. And so that's really the first big trans-mountain diversion that we see in the region. And that still is diverting water today. If you go to Rocky Mountain National Park and go to the west side, you will see this Grand River Ditch on the other side of the mountain from where Trail Ridge Road goes. And so it's something that I would urge you to look for next time you're up there. So on this timeline, I put in Grand Ditch, and there was another reservoir called Chambers Lake that's built far up Poudre Canyon. And then you have a group from Greeley that come up with a scheme to drill a tunnel underneath a ridge that separates the Laramie River from the Poudre River. And this tunnel is going to bring almost all the water from the Laramie River to the Poudre to be able to grow more crops far out in east of Nunn, all the way out towards Briggsdale, called the Laramie Poudre Canal. And under Colorado water law, it was going to work great because there were no downstream users in Colorado who were going to be harmed. And so the irrigation company was able to sell shares, and they got it going. Little did they know that people live in Wyoming, and they were actually concerned about that water use as well. And so in 1911, as the tunnel is nearing completion, the folks in Wyoming sue the state of Colorado. And because it's a conflict between two states, it immediately goes to the US Supreme Court. And at that point, the folks in Colorado didn't exactly know how they were going to fight it. The Attorney General and the governor's office didn't really have the expertise needed for this kind of interstate fight. So they looked to the attorney for the ditch company, a guy out of Greeley named Delph Carpenter, to be their attorney for this case. And so Delph Carpenter takes the reins and follows this case all the way through the Supreme Court process. And in a case like this, it doesn't go directly initially to the justices, that they appoint a special master to weigh the issues and to get all the information. And then later it will go to the Supreme Court justices themselves. And so this process takes many years. And it's not till into the 20s that it becomes obvious that Colorado's going to lose this case. And the Laramie Poudre Ditch Company, they default on their bonds because they can't get the water that they're going to be able, that they've intended to use. And sure enough, in spring of 1922, the US Supreme Court rules in favor of Wyoming. And their ruling is, if you are an upstream state, you can't damage downstream water users in another state. And for the people of Colorado and Wyoming, it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, the Laramie River goes through small towns like Laramie and Wheatland and goes down to Fort Laramie. But there were folks in the American West who realized that was a very large deal because in the early 1920s, a community called Los Angeles was looking upstream at the Colorado River, and there was fear among all the other states that Los Angeles could require every drop of water to come downstream to feed that growing Los Angeles. And so with that in mind, our man Delph Carpenter from Greeley looks and says, there's no way we can be fighting this in court all the time. And so he looked in the Constitution and realized in Section 1, Article 1, Section 10, Paragraph 3, it says states are not allowed to make treaties with each other unless approved by Congress. And he flips that and says, maybe we could have a treaty among the states and then get it approved by Congress to manage water resources in the West. And so, with the help of the Treasury or the Secretary of Commerce, excuse me, a guy named Herbert Hoover, they got the 7 state representatives together and they drafted up and ratified this document called the Colorado River Compact. And so that happened 103 years ago, actually, to be 103 years ago this fall that occurred. And it still guides us to this day. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that compact as we get towards the end of this presentation, because it actually has an effect not only on the Colorado Big Thompson project, but also Chimney Hollow and future water use as well. So moving on. So with that ruling in hand in the 1920s, Northern Colorado realizes that we cannot look to Wyoming or rivers that flow into Wyoming to get our water. And so they start looking at the Colorado River, recognizing that this agreement had been worked out where Colorado is able to keep some of the water for its own use and then send more downstream. And through that process, they recognized that if the west slope, the towns west of the Continental Divide, if they grew, they would need a certain amount of water. And if all the agricultural land that was close to the river got developed, it would need another section of water. And there is a huge amount of unappropriated or extra water beyond what Western Colorado needed that could be harnessed for use on the east slope. And as the east slope folks start talking to the west slope, they come to the agreement that a stronger Colorado is more important than just sending extra water downstream to California and to Arizona. And so with that, in 1937, Congress approves what will become the Colorado Big Thompson Project. And so this is a project that brings over basically the equivalent of another Poudre River to the Front Range every year for mostly, well, it started almost exclusively for irrigation. And then now it's about 50-50 on how much gets used for city use versus agricultural use. And it has proved to be a very important piece to our water puzzle. So this gets fully operational in the late 1950s, and it starts showing the benefits immediately because you had a crop, the most popular crop and the biggest cash crop of Northern Colorado at the time was sugar beets. And sugar beets need not only water at the beginning of the summer, but they need a lot of water at the end of the summer and even going into October to set that sugar to get a higher concentration and bring better prices for your sugar beets. And so with that, this area blossoms. But there's other folks who see that Northern Colorado has taken the highs and lows of their water supply and really smoothed them out. In 1959, a couple of gentlemen come to the Loveland City Council and they say, "We're glad to see that you've solved your water problems. If you were to give us some of that water and maybe a good deal on land and maybe a good deal on taxes, we would like to move a manufacturing plant here." And as we all know, economic incentive packages like this are very controversial. And in 1959, in a split vote, the Loveland City Council does finally agree. "Mr. Hewlett, Mr. Packard, we're not exactly sure what you do, but why don't you bring your plant here?" And Hewlett and Packard like it so much here that they build a plant in Loveland, in Greeley, in Fort Collins, and the copycats in their industry, and IBM builds a plant down by Boulder, and Eastman Kodak builds a plant in Windsor. And pretty soon, this area is transformed from being a backwater sugar beet growing area to being an area that has a very diverse economy. However, there's a flaw with that. And the flaw comes from these cities where the tech barons start building their factories, and they realize we don't want to kill the golden goose of northern Colorado agriculture. And so these 6 cities come together and create a whole new project. And so I'm going to bring up this slide. And again, we had rapid population growth in northern Colorado in the 60s. And so 6 of those cities, Fort Collins, Loveland, Longmont, Greeley, Boulder, and Estes Park, come together and they say, we would like to look to develop additional water supplies. And so they look at the Colorado Big Thompson project and realize that there were some pieces, components of it, that the federal government didn't build as part of the original project. And so just downstream of Granby, Colorado, where the Fraser River joins the Colorado, they file a water right for water to be used for municipal purposes only. And so just for the cities, so that these growing communities will stop buying the water rights off of farms. And from that comes the municipal subdistrict, because it's for municipal use and it's a subdistrict. It's fully contained within Northern Water boundaries, but just within city limits. And it's important to note that that Northern Water, the large Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, which is the local partner to distribute CBT water, we're funded in part by a property tax that goes over every property within the district boundaries. Well, this municipal subdistrict gets formed and they don't charge a property tax. They get their revenue from water bills. So as they develop these water supplies and they distribute it in their communities, it's the users who pay the freight, and it's not a property tax. And that becomes important as we start talking about how this water goes beyond just the original 6 cities and starts going towards other municipal uses. So again, we've started with, okay, we developed the water on the Front Range, then we started looking beyond the Continental Divide. And by the 1960s and 70s, we're really adding to that for municipal use in northern Colorado. And so the Windy Gap project gets conceived in the late 60s, early 70s, and gets built in the 1980s. And so I will run my mouse here to show you. There's a little reservoir just downstream of Granby, Colorado, called Windy Gap Reservoir. It is not a storage reservoir. In fact, it's really kind of a large puddle. But what it does, it has a dam that backs up water that then gets pumped, as you can see in this little graphic, up to Lake Granby. And so that municipal additional water is using the infrastructure of the Colorado Big Thompson project, but it's being stored in this big federal reservoir called Lake Granby. And they knew at that time that there were some flaws in how this project would operate. Because first of all, the water right for this Windy Gap project is very junior. It's in the 1960s. And while as someone who was born around then appreciates being called very junior, it is a water right that does not come into use every year. So for some years, in dry years, the yield of the project is 0. But even worse, in a really wet year, if Lake Granby fills up to the top, then it is filled with federal water. And by contract, all of the water in Lake Granby, if it hits the very top, is federal water. And so if there's been any water from Windy Gap that has been pumped up into Lake Granby, and then Lake Granby rises and goes over the spillway, the first water to go over the spillway is Windy Gap water, regardless of where the molecules came from, but really because of that contractual relationship between this municipal subdistrict, between those cities and the federal government that owns and had operated Lake Granby. And so those communities knew that there would come a day when they would need to build a reservoir just for this Windy Gap water. Because there's nothing worse than seeing, a year in which there's maybe a big snowpack and big snowpack on that side of the continental divide, but maybe it's dry over here that we can't access that water. Or, and living in Colorado, we live with the reality that if we have a wet year, we need to save that water because it's going to be dry next year. Because we all know that Colorado water does not go up and down, or it does not go flat. It goes up and down and up and down. And so that reality is put into place that that as we smooth out the hydrology of this area, one of the ways we do that is through reservoirs. It's not the only way. We do it through demand and we do it through other means, but reservoirs really help us get through those dry times. So on the right-hand side of your screen here, you see the communities that, as of now, own those shares in this municipal gap municipal subdistrict Windy Gap project, including Loveland, Longmont, Central Weld. Berthoud even has a share or two. Fort Collins, interestingly enough, sold and transferred its units to the Rawhide Power Plant, so part of Platte River Power Authority. But it's interesting because Rawhide takes their water from the Fort Collins wastewater treatment plant. So in other words, this water from this project goes through the pipes of Fort Collins and then later on gets treated and goes up to fulfill the cooling needs up at Rawhide. So moving onward, in 2003, boy, when those cities talked about someday we'll need reservoir storage, well, that year came in 2002, 2003. Horrible drought. And for those of you who lived here, you remember that watering restrictions meant that everybody's lawns turned brown by end of July. And so at that point, those communities came together and said, now's the time to develop that reservoir. And so what they did was they said, instead of competing against each other, trying to build little reservoirs for this project, let's put our money together and buy a piece of property and build a reservoir on it. Well, it just so happened there was a piece of property for sale very close to Carter Lake. And the owner of it had bought that big ranch in the 60s to be an employee retreat center. And so no one was living there. That property owner was Hewlett Packard. And so Hewlett Packard was actually looking at that time in 2003, 2004 to divest itself of this asset that it had acquired because of them moving to northern Colorado. And so when Northern Water looked at this piece of property, we said, well, that would be great for a reservoir, but it actually goes all the way up to the ridge and it's too expensive. Larimer County was approached and they asked about this as well. They had a new sales tax for open space, but even then it was too big and too expensive for them. So at some point, and I don't know exactly who called who first, Northern Water and Larimer County got together and said, if we pool our money, we can buy this property for a reservoir, new recreation area, and actually new water recreation. And so it was really a perfect compromise for these governmental entities. And so the statistics on this reservoir, this site will allow us to put in a 90,000 acre foot reservoir. So just a little bit smaller than Carter Lake, which is basically one ridge over to the east. It will allow for 30,000 acre feet to be put into the reservoir each year and taken out when it's needed. Now, what's interesting is that Windy Gap project that we talked about, in some years, no water can come out, so it's firm yield is zero. In other years, 45, 50,000 acre feet can come out and can be stored for a later use if there's space available. And so we've been using water through this project since the mid 1980s. And it is accounted for actually by that Colorado River Compact. What's going to be different is instead of having those high and low years, it's going to be also smoothed out. And for the cities looking to use this water, it's water that they know will help them really during drought, that they're not going to run this like an irrigation reservoir. They're not going to go up and down as drastically as you see sometimes Carter Lake and Horsetooth, that they recognize that this is a storage bucket for the dry time that we know is coming. I had a former boss here that said, you're either going into a drought or coming out of a drought. And unfortunately, we've been having a few not lucky, but high water years. So we might just be entering a drought. And so this is going to be a great bucket to be able to store water. It's 740 surface acres. And the participants, there ended up being beyond those original 6 cities, there are now 12 participants who own a share of water rights for this reservoir. So that gets us to the fun stuff. We're building a reservoir. And in August of 2021, we broke ground on this project. And the pictures don't do it justice. It is huge. That in addition to being a place that will store 90,000 acre feet of water, that it's going to have the tallest dam in Larimer County, and actually taller than any other dam in the Colorado Big Thompson project. And it has rocks and material that were mined or quarried within the footprint of the reservoir that are forming the dam. And so what that has done is that means there's no truck traffic with all of the dirt coming up that road. And we'll talk a little bit about there are 4 really main ingredients that we do have to import, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this project, I have to admit that this slide is a little bit old because we're actually ramping down from the 400 people that were working on this a few months ago. That in August 21, the contractor said we can get this built in 4 years. And I'm happy, very happy to say, not only are they going to hit that August 25 deadline, they're actually going to exceed it. That we're looking at by the end of June that they will have completed the dam and will start putting water into it in early July. So yeah, so right now there's probably 250 people on site. The maximum was 500. And in fact, that was one of the resources that we had to import from elsewhere, that we had 4 major things coming onto site. Workers, cement for the concrete, diesel fuel for the engines of the big yellow machinery, and then asphalt. And why asphalt? Well, there's something curious about the geology out there, that it is actually the boundary between the Rocky Mountains on the west and the ancient Rockies that had been eroded away into sandstone and shale and mudstone on the east side. And it's those sedimentary rocks that create the red cliffs that you see out by Masonville and all the way down to Red Rocks Amphitheater down in Denver, that those sedimentary rocks that have been tilted up, they're gorgeous to look at, but they're not that great for building a dam. And so having that igneous, that granite on one side really made the dam stronger. The downside is that in sandstone and shale, you have clay. And for dams like Horsetooth and Carter Lake, there is enough of that clay that they could put that in the center of the dam and it would prevent water from going through. And here, because there was not enough clay, we had to build what's called an asphalt core dam. And so you see in this picture these gentlemen wearing their safety vests, and there's a black stripe coming down the middle of the picture. And what that is that's a 1 meter or 3.3 foot wide layer of asphalt that serves as the water stop for the dam and for the reservoir. So water will inundate the upstream side, the south side, and hit that asphalt core and not be able to get through. Now, there's plenty of places in Europe where they don't have enough clay, and that's where this technique has been taken from. So in the United States, this will be the second of the asphalt core dams on this continent, but throughout Europe, there's dozens of them that span, almost 75 years old now and have a proven track record of safety. So through the work that we're doing, we're of course building a main dam, actually just 2.5 miles south at the other end of the valley. We're building a small 40-foot dam that actually will allow the reservoir to be raised again, that 35 feet, that in doing so adds 30% more capacity to the reservoir. So instead of being a 63,000 acre foot dam, it's now a 90,000 acre foot dam or reservoir. The quarry I just talked about, that's where we're getting the materials for the dam. Access roads, and we're going to talk about this in just a moment, that we're actually building the roads on that property to Larimer County specifications so that when we're complete with our side of the project, Larimer County can come in and they don't have to move a bunch of dirt, that they've got roads that they can use as the base for the development of their open space and recreation area. There is a spillway, but you need to know that this is an off-channel reservoir. It's a very small bathtub, actually, that if there was a major rainstorm, it's not going to really affect the water level. And also, the water in that reservoir is going to be water from that Windy Gap project that we put into the reservoir and take out. So if that reservoir rises up to the spillway, it means that we've made the mistake of putting too much water into it. And then the conveyance system, that's basically how are we going to get water from here to there? There's a tunnel because you can't just go put your water through the dam. We actually built a tunnel around the dam to be able to get the water into it. A valve house that controls where the water is going to come in and out. And then the pipelines to be able to connect it to the Colorado Big Thompson delivery system. Because again, we're going to lean on that federal infrastructure to deliver the water. But because this reservoir is so close, it actually turns out to be probably the most convenient and most efficient site for a reservoir of this type in northern Colorado. Just some quick other components and a really new photo. This photo that you see here is the inlet outlet tower that is inside the reservoir footprint. This is where water will be delivered into the reservoir, and then when we need water to take out, it'll come out also through this tower. And so that's being built right now, and it's almost complete. There's, again, that pipeline that brings water in and out, goes through a tunnel that is right behind this tower. So you can't see the opening to the tunnel. The dam at the south end I talked about is complete, that saddle dam. And other things of progress, well, before we start up, we've just put in the final valves. They came from Germany, and I have to tell you that we are glad they came when they did, because we had not anticipated tariffs, and they certainly arrived before any tariffs would have been applied to them. And then the last bullet point here, we're going to be starting this up in July. And that's going to require work with the Bureau of Reclamation because, again, we use federal infrastructure to move this water. But we have an opportunity. And that opportunity is because, honestly, the lawsuit regarding Denver did not affect this at all, but Denver's construction of Gross Reservoir Dam expansion means that they aren't going to be using some of their water rights this year. So we'll be able to put in about half the water needed for this reservoir by the first, or by really by February 1st of 26. And so if you think about a 45,000 acre foot reservoir, that's about the size of Boyd Lake when it's completely full. And so even at halfway full, this is going to be a large reservoir in Larimer County. And so that commissioning plan is in still being finalized with the Bureau of Reclamation, but we see that the snowpack looks good this year. And in fact, by moving over the water this year, it's actually not going to have that big of an effect on Lake Granby. It might bring down Lake Granby a few inches or up to a foot, but it's something that is certainly within what a normal operation summer might look like. So I'm getting close to wrapping up. Just the last piece that I'll tell you about is, again, we're finishing up that top part of the dam, and it has gotten so narrow at the top that we can't use the big trucks anymore. And so the big trucks are starting to leave so that we can fit all the personnel and fit the smaller loads on top. We did have a specialty crew from Europe who is doing that asphalt core because, again, it's something that's much more common over there. We didn't want some contractor learning on the job here with our dam in Loveland. We have limited quarry production to finish up the rock that we need. And the main dam is now more than 320 feet tall. It's on its way to 350. Okay, this is my last slide about this part of the project, and that is Larimer County has agreed, and this is an agreement that goes back 25 years, that they're going to manage the recreation on this site. And so they've been doing the scoping. The master plan for this has been published. It's on the Larimer County Natural Resources webpage. They think 50,000 people will use this. And what's interesting about it is it's not going to be like Carter or Horsetooth and have a bunch of power boats. It's going to be wakeless and really attract the quiet users, the folks on paddleboards, the folks on kayaks, the folks with trolling motors and sailboats. We think it's going to be a great amenity. The other element of that is it's going to be day use only, that the county has looked at the site and said, there's really not enough spaces for a campground that would recover its costs, that the county parks do need to pay their own way, and there's not that camping revenue that they could generate from it being an overnight stay. All right, the last slide is just talking a little bit about what are the environmental impacts of this reservoir. Well, the reservoir site itself does not have any endangered species that go through it, and it may have had an acre or two of wetlands. But the bigger concern about the environmental impacts was about taking more water out of the Colorado River on the west slope. And so to address that, we looked at the Windy Gap Reservoir that was commissioned and completed in 85 and said, that can be altered to increase the health of the Colorado River. And so, if you haven't moved your screen with people's pictures on it, if you move it out of the right-hand side of the screen, you see that the Colorado River, in original operations, came through the reservoir and was backed up by this dam on the Colorado River at Windy Gap Reservoir. And as part of this project, what we've done is to breach this portion of the dam and create an artificial channel that goes around the reservoir and reconnects with the Colorado River. And so it's called the Colorado River Connectivity Channel, and it's been something that that Grand County is ecstatic about, because in addition to just providing better water movement and river health, it is going to provide additional recreation access to the Colorado River that right now is almost entirely in private hands. And so this is going to be another amenity for Grand County that's really going to improve quality of life on their side of the hill and be able to move water around that reservoir when we're not in priority. And certainly during times in spring runoff, we certainly can't capture all that water. And so that those big flows, again, are going to be taking sediment and instead of depositing it in the reservoir, are going to be sending it around the reservoir in this connectivity channel. So I'm going to leave this slide up for just a moment, but also at the end, I'll put this back up at the end of the talk because I want to talk about and answer questions that you might have had. I spent almost an hour continuously talking, and I apologize for that. But I think it's important to kind of know where we came from to know where we are now. That, and especially if you're not from Colorado, you might not, well, I'm sure you know, "Huh, it's dry around here. But what does that mean in terms of how we have built our communities? And basically, we've built our communities by being able to build big ditches and to retime runoff so it doesn't all go downstream during June, that we can save some of it for use all throughout the year. So with that, I would welcome any questions or comments that you have for me tonight.
Thanks so much. Go ahead, Fran.
I have one question from way back. The original contract, what kind of use is beneficial and what kind of isn't? Because it sounded like people who are growing things and selling them wouldn't fit that category.
So agricultural use is a beneficial use.
I see.
And so it's really agriculture, municipal use, and industrial use. Where it gets a little bit tricky, and I don't want to open too big of a can of worms, but looking at or aesthetic reasons is not a beneficial use.
I see.
And so for those of us from Loveland, you know, we see and are concerned about Lake Loveland. Unfortunately, well, I feel both sides on this, that that having a beautiful reservoir next to you just to look at doesn't meet the letter of the law. That water has to be put to use, and right now it's owned by Greeley Loveland Irrigation Company for use downstream. What is interesting about that is the water in that lake used to be held for a lot longer into the season because it grew a lot of sugar beets that need water in September and October. So you wouldn't see it being drawn down in the summer like you do a little bit now, that it would be there all the way through till really into the fall. But I don't want to go too far off on that tangent.
Sharon, you had a question at the beginning.
Yes, I did. In fact, I have three, but I'm going to start with the main one. Is there any plan for development of homes around the reservoir or near the reservoir?
That's a great question. So regarding the property sale, we actually bought the land kind of on the east side going up the cliff face. And the Larimer County part, the open space, goes almost all the way up to the top of the ridge. So there's no development planned there. And in fact, there's a conservation easement owned and held by the city of Loveland to make sure that in the future, if for some reason Larimer County sells it, that future owners would not be able to build on there as well.
Oh, okay. All right.
I'm going to tackle the first question from the chat, and that it's about recreation use and whether Parks and Wildlife Rangers will be stationed at the reservoir. It's actually going to be managed by Larimer County. And so I don't know that they will have a ranger housed there, but I know that it's going to be part of their patrols for both Pinewood, Flatiron, and I know that they have a big contingency at Carter Lake. And so it's going to be added to the mix of current enforcement at Pinewood, which actually has a very similar recreation profile of wakeless boating up there.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
Jeff, I was out at Carter and Pinewood on Sunday, and I noticed, to my surprise, how full they are.
Yes.
And usually, I mean, I was out there in December and they were down really low. Why are they so full now?
That the answer to that is the Bureau of Reclamation had some maintenance and some work that they wanted to do really in this month of April, that they wanted it to be a little bit warmer to do some of their maintenance activities.
Mhm.
And so they actually retimed their schedule a little bit to fill up the reservoirs in late winter. And the way the project works is that if you imagine we start the year with a full reservoir kind of June 1st. And over the course of the real high demand season, that reservoir comes down. And at the same time, um, over on the west slope, Lake Granby is actually pretty low and it gets filled up with the runoff from
Mhm.
snow. And so then into the fall and the winter, they send water from Lake Granby to fill up reservoirs on this side. And so
Okay.
it's always a 2-year cycle of high water on the west side fills up the east side, and then there's space for the snowmelt to go into the west side when we're using the water over
Okay.
on this side. I don't,
Okay.
it's counterintuitive, but it's kind of elegant in how it works.
Well,
I
I'm
see
glad we're,
Kathy has her hand raised.
Yeah, uh, people have been really concerned about building new homes, new communities in this area ever since we moved here. I've been reading about that, and we moved in 2015. Um, when a new development goes in, can you comment about the relationship of this reservoir with how people should be thinking about, the population growth in the area?
Sure. Well, the first part of the answer you're not going to like, and that is if we removed all the farms in northern Colorado, there'd be plenty of water for houses.
Hmm.
But the second part of that is how communities develop and manage their water supplies.
Mhm.
And since this project was really conceived in the 60s and built in the 80s, the communities that are participating in this, I would call kind of the older established communities. They're Loveland, Longmont, Greeley, and they're looking at this to store a water right that they already had access to. And so for that reason, when a builder comes to them, those communities aren't asking for them to bring in water. They're asking them to pay to contribute to the construction costs of these types of projects. And it's called an in lieu fee. And so I know that Loveland has an in lieu. I know Greeley has an in lieu, and several of the communities in this project charge developers, how many houses are you going to build? How many taps? Well, okay, here's the calculation of how much it's going to cost. And
Mhm.
so that's why you see, I mean, Greeley still has a lot of growth happening in ways that some of these communities don't. And I would, I'll just make the plug. Y'all should invite me back here in a couple of months to talk about the Northern Integrated Supply Project. That's the one being built north of Fort Collins.
Mm.
And that's really being developed for communities that really have grown in the past 30 years, like Severance, Timnath, Windsor. That those communities, I mean, I had in my bio that I grew up in Greeley and went to school at Fort Collins. Well, I drove through Severance a lot, and there was one house, a gas station, and Bruce's Bar. And now there's several gas stations, Bruce's Bar, and about 3,000 houses. And that really speaks to how these communities, they're, and I would have to say they're not encouraging growth as much as adapting to the demands of people who come to, come to go to school at CSU and decide that they want to stay here and, you know, have their dream of building a brewery or having a high-tech company of some kind. Or people like me, who I grew up in the area and now I have a couple of kids, and I'd sure love for them to move out of my house. And no, I love having them here. But in terms of the housing situation, it's still expensive to get a water tap. But I have to tell you, it's not because there's no water. It's because just water is expensive.
So can I flip it just a little bit and
Yeah.
say, what about fracking needs? If they want to start putting in more wells, how does that impact this water?
Yeah, and that's one where when I talk about this, it's hard because it's a matter of scale that we talk about. We talk in the water world of acre feet,
Mhm.
and so that's 325,851 gallons. And so if you have a fracking operation that uses 3 million gallons, well, that's 9 acre feet. And so if you think about Chimney Hollow Reservoir being 90,000 acre feet, then that's 1/10,000th of the water that's going in there. And and so as we think about oil and gas, we are concerned about certainly, water quality, but and what's going to emerge in the water that comes out. But the oil and gas companies have gotten better at being able to recycle that water, and so they're not using millions of gallons for every well. And and to be honest, from a raw water provider standpoint, we're bringing over 200,000 acre feet each year, which is tens of billions of gallons.
Mhm.
And so from the fracking standpoint, yes, it is a matter of concern, but I would say it's less of a matter of water quantity concern than water quality.
Okay, thanks.
I wanted to ask, who are what are the names of the other cities that are part of the project now? Because it's
Oh.
grown.
I'm sorry, you'll have to see the back of my head as I read. I've got them all written on a board here.
Oh, okay.
And I'm going to read them in descending order. So the higher up on the list is the greater percentage. The top one is Broomfield. And something you need to know about Broomfield is that in the late 1990s, they detected in their water storage reservoir plutonium from Rocky Flats. And basically, the Department of Energy wrote Broomfield a very, very large check to ask them not to use their original reservoir anymore for municipal water supply. So Broomfield then became a large participant in this project, and they own about just under 30%. And it's really going to be their water supply. And because of the way that city and county is configured, they have no direction to grow. So then after that is Platte River Power Authority. And they're an interesting case because as they ramp down the turbines in Rawhide, they might not need as much. And they've actually already started selling a few of their units to communities like Berthoud. But Berthoud is still very, very, very low. So after PRPA is Loveland, Greeley, Longmont. So the three big cities of northern Colorado. And then it goes to Erie, the Little Thompson Water District. And so that's this area kind of south of Loveland and all the way east over beyond the interstate. Then we have a group from farther south. We've got Superior, Louisville, Lafayette, and then we have the Weld County side, and these are the two smallest, Fort Lupton and the Central Weld County Water District. And so that's that Highway 85 corridor that's growing as people move to Platteville and Gilcrest because it's cheaper to build there than other places. So those are the 12 participants.
Okay,
And you mentioned when you were talking about oil and gas recycling some of their water. What about cities using gray water? I've heard some of that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and so and this goes back to actually a key component of Colorado water law, because in the river where in the basin where you draw water from the river, you can only use it once. So if you're a municipal user, you consume it, and then it goes through the wastewater treatment plant and gets returned to the river. And someone downstream has a water right to use that. And so, and the estimate is that water gets used 7 times before it hits the county line. And and what that means is for CBT, if we're bringing over 200,000 acre feet, then 100,000 acre feet is returning to the river and going downstream, getting used again. And then 50,000, 25,000, 12,000 till it gets out, and it's mostly been used by the state line. In Colorado, on the South Platte, I talked about it at the very beginning when Stephen Long and his crew came upstream in Platteville, there was no water in the river by the time he got here. And what irrigation has done because of that return flow, now the river flows year round into Nebraska in a way that it never did during the pre-settlement days in northern Colorado. So what that means is that most cities have have not much water that they can recycle. And let me back up just a second. So when you put in for a water right, you need to make sure you're not harming any other users downstream. If you're using water from on the other side of the Continental Divide, like Windy Gap water, well, there was no expectation that it was going to be available to water users on this side. And so Windy Gap water, you can use and reuse to extinction till it all is evaporated, basically. And so for communities that are Windy Gap participants, they will be able to incorporate much more water recycling and have it be legal under Colorado water law than others that don't. And you might ask, well, isn't CBT trans-basin diversion also? And the answer is, it is, but the only way that the people in counties to the east of Greeley would have voted for it was to have that requirement that we send the return flows downstream, that they're a beneficiary of the river. And it leads to an interesting question, because as we are getting more efficient on the Front Range with our irrigation and with all the things that we do, they're actually seeing less water out on the farms east of Greeley than they used to 50 years ago. And that's because, we no longer do flood irrigation. And, sprinklers, some of that water will go down to the water table and downstream. Drip, you'll never see water going in seeping out of a drip system, which, for as much as a drip system, drip systems are great, and especially for homeowner use. On a farm, that would really have devastating effects on the farms downstream. And it's funny, I talk to people, I'm part of, again, those 7 states in the Colorado River Compact. There's a group called the Colorado River Water Users Association, and I serve as the Colorado representative on the Public Affairs Committee for CRUA. And the people in California and Arizona have no idea of what return flow is, that because they're at the bottom of the basin, they're able to recycle more, and they look at us and say, well, why don't you recycle more? And the answer is, well, if we did, you'd never get any water down there. So
Okay. And is recycled water like reclaimed water? I hear my brother-in-law, he's in Florida, and for his
Yes, I would say yes. I mean, it's kind of interesting that anybody who lives downstream is kind of drinking reclaimed water that, unless you're getting just pure well water, and depending on the well water, it might still be just filtering out kind of rivers as they go down. We're all drinking reclaimed water, that there's a finite amount, and we're all just treating and wastewater treating the same water through millennia.
well, he's using that water, the reclaimed water, for his landscaping. So he's
Oh,
not
okay.
being charged, like we are here when we run our
Right.
sprinklers. Yeah.
Right. And by the way, I had to phone a friend about, I was going to tell the story that I used to work with League of Women Voters with Frances Moore was her name. And she was on the school board for many years. And I just, she was dear to me at the Reporter Herald because we had the same goals of educating the public on the big issues that face us. So yeah, we're coming up near the end of our time. I'm looking at the written questions. Oh, there's a couple of new ones I need to click on. Hello. Okay. I think that all the written questions I've addressed as well. A couple of things while I've got a captive audience here. We talked about it a little bit, that Northern Water, 30 years ago was very interested in increasing the efficiency of irrigated agriculture. These days, there are other entities that do that. And also these days, much of the water in the project is controlled by municipalities. And so we've retooled and redesigned the gardens behind our building to really address municipal landscaping use. And I would invite you to come here because we have many different demonstration gardens to show that you don't need to have a carpet of turf, that there are other alternatives. And especially if you live in an HOA and have community areas. I know there's some neighborhoods in Loveland where there's medians that have grass, and the only person who ever touches it is the guy who mows it. And that's not functional turf. And we can make something that you can have something that's as beautiful as that, and where this really appeals to HOAs, costs much less money. So please come visit us. And if you come here during business hours and you come in the front door and ask for me, if I'm here, I'll come out and chat with you.
Can you imagine HOAs being positive about? I highly recommend seeing their displays of what you can do.
Well, because one of our demonstration areas is actually, we built in the middle of our gardens, we built a curved median and have all sorts of different things to show HOAs. And like I said, I mean, there are some HOA board members who are all about, we should do it because it's the right thing. But there are many more who look at how much their landscaping contractor is charging them. And then they say, oh, well, okay, this is something we can get behind.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions for Jeff?
I just want to comment on our HOA because they took some of the areas, the common areas that had grass, and they've made them xeric landscaping within the past year. So
And
I
I
give
have to
them
tell you
credit.
that you will have to have some patience with some of that. Greeley, our friends in Greeley kind of try to convert a park to some xeric landscape, and it takes a couple of years for that to take. And so Greeley didn't like it the first summer and ripped it back out, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
The other thing with HOAs, if you use, this area used to be shortgrass, native shortgrass prairie, and but short grass still sticks up a few inches, but it looks so much better if you let it grow long and have the seed pods than if you try to mow a short grass prairie. It just looks terrible. And so we actually have an area where we have short grass, native grasses in their mowed condition and in their unmowed. And those are delightful to see what you can do there. I would ask you that if you, so here's context to our projects and certainly my email and phone number. One item that I did not list on here is if you go to the website YouTube, if you've ever been there, you know there's videos about everything. If you go to YouTube and just search for Northern Water, we actually have our own channel that we've been putting videos up about our construction projects, but also about our water conservation and also about the issues that are facing us in Colorado. And so I would certainly encourage you to take a look at our video page.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of those videos, Jeff. I would agree. They're really wonderful. You have an excellent YouTube channel. It's there's a lot of information there on all big range of things. I wanted to ask if you could say anything. I think you found your tribe here about re-landscaping. Could you say anything about the grant that the grant program that Northern Water offers for re-landscaping projects?
Yeah, so we do have also to encourage some of our commercial and HOA friends to look more closely at re-landscaping. We do offer a grant program. It is not available to individual homeowners. It's available really to those commercial property and HOAs that we will do, we can do some cost sharing, and some of that can be met by cash, others by labor. But we do offer a grant program that it really, we take the applications in the late summer and fall. Usually we require you to have a consultation session with us that before we give you grant money, we want to make sure that you've got kind of a plan in place, and we can help you with that plan. But we want to make sure that we're not chasing something where the maintenance might not be appropriate in years to come. That we want to make sure that we're making substantial change that will allow for water savings. Because what it's really about is that we have a special relationship with the West Slope. Sometimes they'll look side eyes at us and say, "Special, that's what you're calling it?" But we have a relationship with the West Slope that we are bringing over water that is from the Colorado River Basin for use on the Front Range. And it is my firm belief as a Greeley, Colorado native that this water has made all of Colorado, stronger. And with that said, though, we need to be stewards of that water and make sure that we're using it as efficiently as we can. And so that's something that we take seriously here at Northern Water.
I would encourage all of you to, if you have friends who should be thinking about this stuff and should be informed and are willing to be informed, this will be available on our website, Jeff's presentation. Any other questions?
No, but I would really like to thank Jeff for such a
Yes.
wonderful presentation. We've really learned a lot from what you've had to say. Lots to think about too.
Thank you. Well, and for those of you who knew me in my newspaper days, that I've landed at a place where I get to tell an important story and use my background from being a kid here to being a newspaper editor here, that I really would encourage, if you ever come across a water story that just doesn't sound right, give me a buzz, and I can usually translate what the engineers are trying to say into plain English.
Great.
In these challenging times, we really welcome the expertise and the constructiveness of people like Jeff Stahla.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah, Jeff, you're a really wonderful local treasure. Glad to have you here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. And with that, I think I'm gonna log off. And but I know that I will see you over the course of the next months and years. So yeah, feel free to find me when you're out this direction.
Okay,
Really appreciate it. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Good night.
All right, thank you.
thank
night.
you. I guess we can leave now.
That was wonderful.